They thought the war was over. They thought the screams had finally faded, but beneath the soil of a quiet northern town in Sri Lanka, the earth still hid its darkest secret. In a place where children once played, investigators unearthed bones, small bones, fragile bones, alongside bottles, shoes, and toys. What was buried here was not just human remains. It was a story the world was never meant to uncover. Stay with us, because what we are about to reveal will shatter the silence of history and leave you questioning how many truths can be buried before the ground itself begins to speak. The Sri Lankan Civil War had officially ended in 2009, leaving behind promises of peace. Yet for families in the north, peace never came. They still lived with unanswered questions. Where were their missing sons? Where were their daughters, their husbands, their mothers? For decades, countless people had simply vanished, swallowed by the violence. Some whispered that the earth itself had become their graveyard. Chemmani, a small village near Jaffna, looked ordinary. Narrow streets, dry winds, families struggling to rebuild. But beneath its dusty soil lay something extraordinary. Whispers of a mass grave had haunted the region for years, spoken of only in hushed tones. Villagers had noticed strange movements at night, trucks driving into fields, and soldiers leaving without explanation. But no one dared ask too many questions. In the late 1990s, rumors began circulating that a soldier had spoken out. He claimed that after the fall of the Jaffna Peninsula, bodies were buried in secret. People who had been arrested, who never returned home, had been taken here. The claim seemed too horrific, and for years it was dismissed as rumor, a ghost story born out of grief. Yet the whispers never died. It wasn't until much later that pressure mounted for an investigation. Families of the disappeared demanded answers. They carried photos, letters, fragments of hope. They marched in, silence, holding placards with names and faces, asking, "Where are they?" The government tried to silence them, but their persistence was unrelenting. The truth, they believed, was waiting beneath the ground. In 1998, a soldier named Somaratne Rajapakse confessed in court that over 400 bodies had been buried in Chemmani. His statement shocked the nation. Suddenly the rumors had a name, a place, a number. The silence that had long protected the soil of Chemmani was now broken. Families demanded that the site be excavated. The truth could no longer be hidden. Excavations began cautiously. At first, there was skepticism. Officials said there might be nothing there. But then, one after another, bones began to surface, human bones, some small, belonging to children. Alongside them lay objects that spoke louder than words, children's slippers, a bottle, scraps of clothing. Each discovery deepened the horror. As the pits widened, investigators realized they were standing on a killing field, disguised as farmland. More than 140 skeletons were uncovered. They were tangled together, limbs crossing, stories silenced forever. The stench of decay had long faded, but the silence of death hung heavy over the site. The villagers who had once avoided the field now watched in shock as the nightmare became real. International organizations demanded accountability. Human rights groups called for forensic analysis and DNA testing. They wanted to give names back to the dead. But the process was slow, obstructed by bureaucracy and silence. For every body found, hundreds more were still missing. The ground had begun to speak, but not loud enough to drown out decades of denial. Families gathered near the excavation site. They held photos of their loved ones, watching as remains were lifted from the earth. Some fainted, some wailed, others stood in silence, their eyes hollow, as if watching the confirmation of what they had feared for years. This was not just an investigation, it was an open wound being torn wider. Reports revealed that many victims bore signs of execution: broken bones, skull fractures, bullet marks. These were not casualties of war. These were deliberate killings, silenced in the shadows, hidden from the public eye. Whoever had buried them intended that they never be found. The discovery ignited anger in the Tamil community, who had long accused the government and military of disappearances. The Chemmani graves became a symbol of their suffering. But instead of justice, many found only frustration. Promises of thorough investigation were made, but progress was painstakingly slow. Journalists who tried to cover the story faced intimidation. Some were followed, threatened, silenced. The truth was too dangerous. For those in power, Chemmani was a wound they did not want reopened. But the bones were undeniable. The earth itself had betrayed their secret. Human rights lawyers argued that Chemmani was only one of many hidden sites across Sri Lanka. If 140 bodies could be buried here, how many more lay undiscovered in other villages, in other fields, in other forests? The horror of Chemmani was not just its existence, but the terrifying possibility that it was only a fraction of the whole. Survivors recalled nights when soldiers came, taking away young men from their homes. Families begged, cried, but the men never returned. Women too disappeared. Children were sometimes taken as leverage. For years these stories were dismissed. Now Chemmani had given them evidence. As bones were catalogued, questions grew. Who were they? What had been done to them? Could they ever be identified? DNA testing was proposed, but resources were scarce. Years passed and families still waited. For some, the waiting became unbearable. They grew old, holding on to photographs, waiting for closure that never came. Political shifts in Sri Lanka complicated the search for truth. Each new government promised to address Chemmani. Each made speeches about justice. But the deeper the digging, the more uncomfortable the truths became. And so the investigations slowed, files were delayed, time itself became another weapon against memory. But Chemmani could not be erased. International observers continued to push. Human rights councils kept the pressure. The families refused to let their grief be buried again. The bones had surfaced, and with them a demand for answers that refused to fade. The grave at Chemmani stood as a haunting reminder of what silence can conceal. For years it was farmland. Children played nearby. Life went on. And yet, beneath every step, a secret was waiting. The ordinariness of the surface made the horror beneath even more unbearable. Some believe Chemmani is a message, a warning carved in soil and bone. It tells us that no atrocity can stay hidden forever. That even when justice is denied, truth finds a way to surface. The earth remembers what men try to forget, and eventually it forces us to confront it. For the families of the missing, Chemmani is both answer and torment. It proves their loved ones did not vanish into thin air, but it also confirms the cruelty they had long suspected. For them, closure remains elusive. The bones tell part of the story, but not the whole. They want names. They want accountability. They want the world to know. Chemmani is not just a grave. It is a mirror held up to a nation, reflecting what it wanted to bury, not just in soil, but in memory. For decades, families begged for answers, and the earth itself responded, yet justice remains distant, as if time conspires to shield the guilty. But history has cracks, and from those cracks, the truth escapes. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of Chemmani is this: no matter how deep you dig, the ground will always remember.